Slideshow.
Beginning.
Let's go from beginning.
Slide. Yeah, there you go.
Great.
Yeah.
All right. Hi, everyone. So this is my thesis, and I guess what it's actually about is I'm trying to say how can you get people as cheaply as possible to cheerfully do your bidding. So I guess with a world-dominating statement like that, you probably guess I'm a computer scientist. But I want to actually argue that economics and computer science make a really natural combination. And I just really want to quickly talk about some areas in which they've commonly been combined. So game theory, of course, as I'm sure you all know, is basically how you study agents' behavior when they're in strategic environments where they have like incentive to do some interesting things. Mechanism design is, of course, the reverse of this, where you say, okay, well, I know agents are going to behave kind of like this, but so how do I make a system in which they somehow behave the best? The interesting thing is that these actually both lend themselves to a lot of algorithmic formulations and also to a lot of algorithmic analysis. So you might try to say, okay, how can I just come up with a solution concept, for a game or something like that, using a lot of techniques from computer science, ranging from the very theoretical foundations to techniques from artificial intelligence, machine learning, very world domination topics. So, but of course, if you even make it into computational political economy, there's some topics like computational social choice and fair division, which is essentially how do you take people's preferences and make something good come out of it. That's also a very computational problem. My problem will actually combine some of the mechanism design flavor. I'm going to design a system, but it's going to depend, it's going to get its interest from how people's preferences actually behave. So it's going to combine somewhat of the flavor of these latter two. I'm specifically interested in some areas of behavioral economics, which is rather new to be combined with computer science. Behavioral economics has its roots in psychology. So you ask, do standard assumptions about economics agents actually apply? Of course, you might question, are people actually rational? Experimentally, you can show that many times they aren't. So then the mathematical, interesting idea is to try to come up with a new paradigm and try and analyze how it works. Recently, we've started introducing computational and algorithmic paradigms, and this thesis hopefully will continue in that vein. All right, so specifically a behavioral economics phenomenon I'd like to talk about is this idea of time inconsistency, which is related to a similar idea of present bias. Time inconsistency basically says my preferences change, my relative preferences change over time. Today I prefer A to B. 10 years from now nothing changes, but I prefer B to A. That's, you can see that'd be kind of a strange thing to say, nothing else really changes. But it can happen. One reason it can happen is because of this phenomenon known as present bias. You can get it through this discounting scheme, which basically says, instead of having the standard exponential, in every period I apply a discount factor again. Instead I say, okay, everything in the future gets discounted by this flat beta parameter less than or equal to 1, and only the present doesn't get discounted. And this, as it turns out, as we're going to show, can lead to time inconsistency. It was actually pointed out to me in the faculty defense that there's actually a variety of this where agents don't even realize that they're time inconsistent, but in fact they are, just as people don't necessarily realize their own irrationality. And this means naive present bias. In this thesis, I'm going to be assuming naivety in that sense. Present bias has been studied a lot in psychology, behavioral economics, and the essential effect is that people, if they're making a decision about what's going to happen right now, they're going to often choose a vice over a virtue, whereas if they were making the decision about what's going to happen to them in 10 years, or a longer period of time, they would choose the virtue over the vice. So essentially that's because, of course, vices have immediate gratification, even if they're less good, in their future, relatively speaking, costs are spread out way far in the future. Virtues have lower immediate gratification, which if you're present bias, you wish there was higher for immediate gratification. There are a lot of applications, including retirement savings and social security systems, things where you want people to buy in and incur costs now, but provide for themselves for the future. But of course, it's been studied in many other things. So you can consider how to consume things appropriately, how to spend your leisure time. One of the big papers that introduced the effects of present bias was studying they thought that The Breakfast Club was a lowbrow movie that you would only choose if you're making a decision what to watch today, versus you would watch something highbrow like Schindler's List. Go figure. If you were choosing what to watch next week. Yeah, I don't know if anyone disagrees with that, but that's what the people who wrote the paper thought. So I went into the computer science part, and so eventually I'm going to be studying planning problems. So I want to motivate agents to actually complete a task. And I can represent this as a graph, which I'll show an example on the next slide. But essentially, in mathematics, you have a graph which has nodes, and it has edges connecting nodes or states to each other. These edges in our model represent actions that an agent can perform to advance it to a new state. Your goal is to eventually get it to take this broad overarching task by advancing from state to state, intermediate tasks as it were, performing actions to do so that have a cost, which you can represent as weights on the edge of the graph. This is a mathematical structure, but it's often studied in computer science because it's pretty easy to analyze algorithmically, and it is useful for modifying a lot of computational phenomena. Here's the challenge of this planning problem. Like I said, such problems have been studied in the literature before, but not with present bias. So, suppose that you're an agent and you discount everything except whatever cost or reward you get in the next period by a factor beta equals 1/2. Everything in the future you value only half as much. If you were to look at this graph, you're trying to get from the node S to the node T. You can see that you should go up to A, then to B, then to T. The problem is that incurs a big cost up front. But it occurs the lowest overall cost, but because there's a big cost up front, a present bias agent, you can do the math to confirm, would go to C first. That will lead to less efficiency. Again, it should then go to D. But again, it would incur a higher cost up front, which is less desirable. And so it would change its mind. It would go down to E, whereas it would go to D, then up to T. So it ends up choosing the worst path, changing his mind about which path it's even going to take to do so. So this illustrates that agents might not behave efficiently. They might change their mind. And in this particular case, we're assuming they have to continue throughout the graph. They have to go from S to T. But it'll get even worse whenever we assume that agents can drop out if they perceive that it's going to cost more than it's worth to them to reach this goal node T. That will make more sense when we talk about the reward structure we're going to introduce. But the point is there could be cases which agents would want to not even continue throughout the graph at all. There's a lot of inefficient behavior that can go on, and our challenge is to say, how can we get rid of this inefficient behavior? Suppose that we, the graph designer, have resources at our disposal with which to issue rewards, and we want agents to actually do the right thing, to take the minimum cost path through this graph. Suppose we can add intermediate rewards to the graph, so we can say, okay, if you get to the state, if you take these actions, get to the state, we'll give you this reward. Where can we place rewards in this graph, and how much should we place, so that we can ensure that the agent finishes it all, does so in an efficient way, and also, ideally, we'd like to do so while spending as little as possible. This idea could have several applications. For example, you could be saying, I'm modeling, the problem facing a government who's saying, I can give aid to, the cities in my country, or to, foreign aid, I guess, to other countries, if they want to do these policy changes that I want them to do. I could offer tax incentives to get people to invest in social security or education. This has applications on a smaller scale. Let's say I'm a teacher, I want students to complete a course. Of course, that smaller scale can even become large scale with paradigms that we've seen that are facilitated by computer science, like massive online open courses. And these courses could have very, very personally applicable scale if you think about you're considering the problem facing someone who's trying to write an economics thesis. This is a very, very meta thesis to write. Because I think about present bias, procrastination, all sorts of things like that. So I don't know. So sometimes you can get some of these times you can get things that really hit close to home. I guess Raul and I both chose things that hit very close to home. Great. So from here on out, I'd like to introduce what I've actually done. And as far as I know, this is all new. Okay, so we need to actually consider what it means for agents to be motivated, because I would say I want to motivate agents. Well, let's just consider what happens if you want an agent to take one more step and not drop out. If I can add rewards somewhere in the graph, and of course the actions have costs of sorts, the path is motivating. There's a path that's motivating. If I put enough rewards on it, the agent perceives them as being bigger than the costs. The agent perceives them with its present bias discount scheme. That's what I mean. Okay, if such a path exists, then the agent will want to move forward because it thinks it's worthwhile to move forward. There is a motivating path. That means also that the agent is in fact motivated. And the motivating rewards, whatever reward I put, that previously maybe the path wasn't good enough as far as the agent is concerned, but now the path is. And that would be an example of a motivating reward. Okay, I need to introduce some new concepts of actually what it means to follow a path. If you only consider a typical planning problem, you say, okay, I'm going to find the efficient path, and then I'm going to say, okay, agent's following it now, right, all the way till the end. It doesn't change its mind. Then you can only work with these two concepts, which I just, I pulled out separately, but they make a lot of sense. So if I never intended to follow a path, I just say I failed to follow it. I say I strongly intend to follow a path if I say I calculate this path, I'm going to follow it, and then every step I'm always like, yeah, I'm going to keep following this path. I don't ever change my mind, basically. I want to contrast this with the notions I introduced that are going to be very important later on, partial following and weak following. So partial following is like what happens to, I think, a lot of people here when they're pre-med, and they start at pre-med, and then they end up not actually going to med school. So you intend at one point to follow this path, but you don't take it all the way to the goal. Weakly following is like maybe if that student then goes on to be like a chemistry PhD or something like that. And so, it started out taking all the science courses anyways, right? Doing the same actions it would. And it ended up going this PhD route. But it wasn't always, the student wasn't necessarily always thinking about, going to grad school instead. So that's just an example of partial following and following. I want to introduce some results that I have, hopefully very intuitive, not math notation, as Professor Peterson suggested. So first of all, if you place a reward on a node and it motivates the agent, I claim that an agent must at least partially follow up. It can't fail to follow the path. There has to be some contingency in which it would consider following that path. Because if you say that an agent will never follow a path, for some reason it's just not allowed to or something, no matter what reward you put on it, well, why would it care what happens on the path, right? This is actually, if you're familiar with the political science literature, this is somewhat familiar to an independence of irrelevant alternatives condition. But hopefully it makes a lot of sense that you have to be willing to claim a reward in order to care about it, or at least in some possibility. The second thing is, if you want an agent to strongly follow a path, you have to put the rewards on the path. Well, why? Because if the rewards are off the path, either the agent doesn't care about them, and then you see the previous proposition, or it does care about them, and that means it intends to follow that path potentially, then it's no longer strongly following, because it's broken its continuous stream of good intentions to take this one path. Alright, finally, I say that if you are considering the problem of just getting this agent to take one more step, you can do at least as well by moving a reward earlier, closer to the present than further in the present. Of course, this makes a lot of sense, right? Everything in the future is discounted. Moving it further in the future, but still in the future, doesn't change anything. If you move it to the present, guess what? You actually are no longer discounted, so that reward is essentially it's more powerful in its effect on the agent. So in terms of only getting the agent to take one more step, you might as well put rewards immediately. Of course, that means that if you put them too soon, then the agent's like, okay, I got that reward, now what? So you have to actually think about whether you want to do this. But if you're just considering the problem, motivating one more step, this holds. This essentially leads into one of our results, which says that strong following, if you want an agent to always guarantee to follow the path, the best you can do is strict immediate reimbursement of all its costs. So, if we go back to the graph, okay, that was really far. Okay, but if I want the agent to follow SABT, and I want to strongly follow it, I just have to pay 16 after it gets to A to reimburse its costs there, 2, and then 2. And so this says that's the best thing to do. That's not the most interesting, of course, because we can already do that in our normal planning problems. It doesn't really take into account present bias. But it's important because as a benchmark, we can say, can we do better than this? The next section is going to be saying, we can actually do better than this in a lot of cases. If we don't insist on the agent always planning on doing the right thing. Okay, finally, of course, it's a baseline. It's a very simple graph. There's only one path to the goal or something. Well, then the agent has no choice. I guess you have to pay it out, right? So it's important for those two reasons. But let's get on to the interesting things. Suppose you are okay with the agent weakly following this path. That means you're okay with it thinking it's going to take this other path that you don't want it to take, as long as you can eventually convince it to take the path that you want it to take. If you're okay with this, in fact, in many cases, you can pay out less than you would have to for strong following. Note that strong following, you paid out exactly the cost it was to the agent. So what this is saying is that in many cases, you can motivate agents to do things for less than it actually costs them to do it. Costs for them to do it, which is very interesting. Essentially what you're going to do is you're going to turn the present bias, instead of a liability like the paper I was inspired by, it was showing all this how agents can behave badly and make inefficient choices. We're turning it into an asset, making it easier for people to motivate agents to do the right thing. Here's the idea. Suppose you have a target path and another path that you want the agent to follow. It's probably your minimum cost path. You have another path that starts out the same. What you should do is you should actually put a big reward, a big decoy reward on this alternative path. Which really sounds paradoxical because you don't want the agents to follow that path. You definitely don't want them to take this reward because it's going to be really big. It's going to be so big that they're going to take a lot of steps for free because they're following this decoy path. You don't have to pay them. Unlike in strong following, where you have to pay them immediately as soon as they take the step. Then, once they're at this fork, okay, if these paths start at the same, at some point they split off. where they diverge, I'm going to say, okay, I don't want you to actually go and actually get the big reward that I promised you. I'm going to put like a switching bonus, like say, okay, if you switch away from that reward, I will give you a big reward in addition to the cost of you actually taking that action. But it won't be as big as the decoy reward, and it also won't be as big as what I would have had to pay out. And I'm going to illustrate if I had done strong following and had paid you for all the steps you took up to the fork, etc. I'm going to give you a numerical example that will illustrate this. Okay, suppose you're an agent, you're starting at the node in green, you're trying to make it to the node in red. These are the costs. The costs are the edges along, are the numbers on the edges on your graph. You discount everything in the future, rewards and costs, by a factor of a third. So something that's worth 9, if it was right now, is only going to be worth 3 to you if it's in the future. So as you can see, the minimum cost path is the path that's all in yellow. But I denote this other path that's like a decoy path, where it diverges from the path that the agent is supposed to weakly follow. I mark it in another color. So here, so anyway, so this is the graph that the agent is facing. The task graph designer wants you to motivate. Okay, so now you have I'm going to claim that I can put this reward of 54. I can try to do this. Technology, I don't know, it's really bad. I'm a computer scientist, or want to be, so I don't know what it says. But, oop. This is why I work with theoretical models. Okay, so anyway, so I think we can put a reward of 54 on, yes, I figured it out. Okay, on this, and this will motivate the agent. Okay, so this is worth only 18 because it's in the future. But what does the agent perceive as the cost here? It thinks it's going to be 3, that's not discounted. Then it's going to do 9 plus 6 plus 6 plus 12 plus 3. These are all discounted by a factor of a third. So it perceives the cost as only 15 of stepping forward, but it perceives the profit as 18. So of course it's going to move forward. It thinks it's worthwhile to move forward. At the next node, you're at this node now. You perceive the cost as 9 in the future. And then, yeah, 6, 6, 12, 3, or 9 in the present, 6, 6, 12, 3, all in the future. Now you perceive the cost as 18. This is in fact higher than you perceived it before. So even though you have fewer steps to take, you perceive it as higher cost because now you're no longer discounting. It's a comparatively big cost. This leads to this potential time inconsistency problem. But that's how I got this reward of how I knew I had to put a reward 15. What essentially my algorithm would say is I need to calculate the cost here, here, and here, as indeed we will do, find out where it is biggest, and set a reward that's just big enough to compensate you for that. The agent, as these calculations show, will just barely want to move forward. We're going to assume that you can break ties as you wish. Okay, otherwise it's say 54 plus epsilon for any epsilon for even sphere. That's really stupid. So anyways, okay, so fine. Next node, okay, you are at this node. Okay, well of course this is great. Okay, I'm almost home stretch. 6 in the future, right now. This in the future. Of course, I perceive it as profit of 5. Of course, I'll move forward. I'm now going to find, the agent is going to find something this fork. It, of course, clearly perceives there being profitable to go to this, to go claim this decoy reward. So, now these question marks coming on. This is because I was going to put a reward here and I didn't specify what. Now I'm going to specify what. Here's the issue. If I pursue this, the agent think I'm going to make a profit of 7. That's what it seems like it's worth to me right now. So if I were to switch to this path right here, I would be forgoing that. That's an opportunity cost I now have. So if I'm the graph designer, I have to offer that as a switching bonus, as an extra bonus above and beyond what I think, what the immediate cost is. The action right after it costs 6. I need to offer it also, as you're going to see, I need to offer it 13. And now, notice after I switch here, I just have to go all the way to the goal. There's no other path I think I could follow. So I have to strongly follow. I have to reimburse the 3, reimburse the 9. But importantly, I gave a cost of 13, which included compensated the opportunity cost of not pursuing the decoy reward anymore. But notice I have to pay extra here, but I didn't have to pay anything at all here. There's going to be big savings. And we're going to come back and break down exactly where these savings come from. And it's in fact very significant. Okay, here's the fine print. So I guess I should read this really quickly like we do on TV. But, first of all, agents' level of present bias has to be between 0 and 1. Those are both really boring cases. They both basically say either the agent's perfectly myopic, and then I guess it only responds to immediate payoffs because it doesn't care at all about the future, or it's perfectly indifferent between present and the future. And then it's just it's no different from the problem that you consider in computer science all the time. So we're also going to place some restrictions either on the graph topology or on the conditions in which we pick out the rewards. Basically what you don't want is I don't want to say, okay, well, I don't want to go up here, switch away from the decoy bonus, and then somehow there's an edge here and I can go back and claim the decoy bonus. That would kind of the decoy reward. That would kind of defeat the purpose of switching bonus. The switching bonus is saying, once and for all, you give up the decoy reward if I pay you this, okay? So basically I'm going to place some restrictions. I think both of those are reasonable. A lot of important families of graphs follow that property. The restriction on the rewards, which is what I do, is also rather reasonable. Finally, the decoy reward is enough that I put this here, not here. Because notice if I put it here, it would not be discounted at the fork. So the agent would be like, I'm going to make 54 right now, not discounted when it's at the fork. So it needs to be long enough that I can put it right here, and then it will still discount it. So it's still like discounted this versus immediate switching bonus. Yeah, I can go with the switching bonus. That way I don't have to pay out this big, ginormous reward after all. So, okay, that was the fine print. So anyway, so here's how the idea works is I have a decoy path. I have a decoy reward, which is basically, it's enough that all the steps up to the fork, the agent will want to move forward. I put a switching bonus, which is once the agent gets to the fork, how much better does it think it's doing if it goes to the decoy reward? I need to make sure it does at least that, it thinks it's doing at least that well by switching away from it. After the last fork, I have to motivate a strong fall. And it turns out you can do this at every fork in the graph. If you have more complicated graphs than the one I considered, and you can do this. But the approach I actually described, you can do this recursively. So the approach I actually described more or less explains how it works even on larger graphs. Okay, how does weak following save? There are three components that I will go back and illustrate in my example right after this, but here's what they are. So first of all, you're going to notice, I'm actually going to go over here right now. This is the node where the agent perceived the cost as being highest to the goal. This is not the first node. But here's the thing. You all know in economics that some costs don't matter. So this cost doesn't actually matter, okay, anymore. Of course, if the maximum perceived cost had been here, then I guess this savings component, it wouldn't mean anything at all because there is nothing before the start node. But in this particular case, guess what I actually have? I actually save because this cost essentially doesn't matter anymore. I don't have to pay it. Finally, also, note that the profit is essentially based on the discounted costs of all the nodes, of all the actions taken up till the fork. This and this. Or specifically this, because this is also in the present. So it's also not discounted. But this essentially is discounted. So essentially it's discounted, but if I had done strong following, I would have had to pay the undiscounted cost. So I save the difference, which turns out to be 4. Finally, if you notice that at the fork, the agent actually thinks this cost is now no longer discounted. Whereas it was when it was way back here, for example. So it's a little bit harder because it's now like, okay, once you get here, I feel this cost a little bit more acutely now that it's in the present. So I have to pay a little bit smaller of a switching bonus to get the switch over here. Not a huge savings, but again, I end up saving some more based on that. So my total savings end up being 11, which you'll also notice is the sum of 13 plus 3 plus 9, 25, minus the actual cost of all the edges, which is 36. So the math does in fact check out. Okay, anyways, the idea behind weak following is that I offer a large reward, and even though it's really far in the future, the agent still takes several steps toward it. They took all these steps for free, essentially. Essentially what I'm doing is I'm tricking them into discounting most of their costs instead of being like, yeah, give me, I want them right away. I want my reimbursement right away. So I essentially get them to discount a lot of the costs instead of having to pay it out right away, as you might think. In practice, you might actually not know how much exactly agents are present biased. So for example, you might say there are in fact a lot of people who this graph might have to be presented to. If you're trying to teach a class, you might be like, well, some students are they're really disciplined and so they don't have too much bias toward the present as opposed to the future. High beta. Some students are like, I only care if it's the night before or something like that, okay? 3 a.m. the night before or something like that. Like watching Netflix all the way up to then or something. So, low, you but you want to give the same, you can't say, oh, I'm going to give you this much reward, I'm going to give you only this much or something. Or you might say, okay, well, I think you're somewhere around here. I have some belief about it between code, probability distributions or something. But again, right, I'm just not sure. Or I know that there are multiple betas out there. Either way, the problem with the approach that I just said is that it's very nice edge, okay? If the agent has a too low present bias parameter, it will see that reward, and it's like, yeah, it's big, but it's also really far off, and it's not worth it, not moving. On the other hand, suppose you have an agent who's like, I'm really responsible, I have a high beta, and I'm not particularly biased for the present. I'll be like, at the fork, I'll be like, great, you're giving me a big, huge reward, right? Like, that reward's so huge, I'm not going to fall for this paltry switching bonus you're giving me. I'm going to go after that reward. Then it's going to call your bluff, basically. That reward at 54 is really huge. So either way, it's not really ideal. And of course, that reward is put on the path that was not even the minimum cost path. So it's going to make a bad choice, and it's going to be bad for you. The graph designer can pay it out a lot. So essentially what you can do is you can say, if I pay out more, I can get more margin for error. Suppose I calculated the decoy reward as if the agent had a low parameter, beta. Its discount bias is very low. I have to pay out more. It requires the decoy reward to be higher, but it does mean that I can get agents with lower beta to also start out at all. Finally, I can also, if I say I'm going to split the switching bonus as if the agent had a high beta, again, I have to set a higher switching bonus. But I can make agents with higher beta still willing to be switched and to take the efficient path they actually wanted them to take. I make higher payouts, but I get more margin for error. It's a trade-off. And it's one that we can explore more interestingly, but here's some open questions I want to say. First of all, I provided no proofs of my algorithm, is guaranteed to be optimal, or as a standard in the approximation algorithms literature, let's say, performs in a factor of 1.364523, times the value of the optimal solution or something. Some of the numbers aren't actually that weird. So finally, I placed some fine print about the restrictions I had to place. I said those restrictions are pretty reasonable, but it would be nice to make them even looser. Finally, what if there are almost as good paths that are easier to motivate? Maybe there's one path that the shortest path cost to the goal, it doesn't have any forks on it. So you have to do strong following. But there's another path that's almost as cheap, that has lots of forks that you can do this decoy, weak following, interesting things, and that's a lot cheaper. That's another interesting trade-off to motivate. Finally, in the simple model I presented of varying levels of present bias, I said, okay, well, you just don't know. You have some belief about the agent's present bias. Maybe you can actually learn more about the agent's present bias by virtue of the fact that the agent got this far. It must have not had this high a present bias parameter. By virtue of the fact that the agent didn't switch away and grab my decoy, it must have had this low a present bias parameter. And so if you have a graph with lots of forks, you might be able to learn as the agent goes throughout the graph. It's an interesting question. So the point is, there's a lot. I have not closed the book on this, but what I think I have done is presented a positive result. Previously, they said, okay, here are all these bad things that can happen, and we present the problem, okay? And I'm going to be like, here's actually what you can do about that. And also, I can say, interestingly enough, that present bias, the agent's present bias, actually allows us to motivate them to do the right thing more easily, instead of making it harder for us to make them do the right thing. Finally, as I mentioned, this is a theoretical model, but there are potential applications in fields ranging from political economy, to education, as I mentioned, on the very large scale of massive online open courses to the very small scale of writing your senior honors thesis. And you can think about these. I don't know. And also, you should all become computer scientists. Cool. Thank you. But yeah, also I want to thank both Professors Peterson for being very patient at this whole process. And also Professor Maggie Penn, who's actually in the political science department, but for some reason was willing to put it on tomfoolery. She actually does great computational and mathematical work, so she inspired me to do a lot of this work, combine computer science and economics. But yeah, anyways. So you guys have questions?
All right, questions for Mark?
Yes.
So I have a friend who went to the Air Force Academy, and I was
yeah.
talking with her recently, and she
Yeah.
said, I actually didn't want to go, but by the time I got in, I had told so many people I was going that I decided I had to.
Yeah.
And so, for this anecdote and also basic
Great, yeah.
interactions with people, that people actually do care very much about sunk cost.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was wondering if there was any research that took that into account and how that would change the algorithms that would demonstrate a path.
That's a really interesting question. So I haven't actually looked at made any assumptions on how sunk cost actually affects people or something like that. Essentially, that would be really interesting if you said, okay, that there is some. You could say, okay, well, if I build into this weekly following thing where I think I'm going to follow this one path, I could make some other penalty for. I'd say I'm willing to weekly follow a path. I'm willing to think I'm going to follow this one path, but then actually switch to the other path. You could build in some type of penalty for switching or something like that. So switching bonus would not only have to compensate the opportunity cost of forgoing the decoy reward, but also just a penalty for changing your mind. That would be really interesting. That's like I said, I don't know. I guess the cool thing with theoretical models is they're sandboxes, and you can do whatever you want with them. So that would actually be a really interesting thing. You could argue, definitely argue, there's a lot of practical relevance to that. I don't know. I have not stopped thinking about this problem, so maybe I will think about that. That's what's interesting. Yeah.
Well, it's very interesting.
Yeah.
What if people have too low a discount rate with regard to the future?
If they have too low a discount rate, then essentially what will happen is that if you put a big decoy reward on, okay, so first of all, strong following works independent of your level of present bias, okay? Because essentially it's really boring, you're just paying them back as soon as they incur the cost. So, but if you're trying to do the weak following thing and they have too low a discount rate, if you were to do the calculation, you would see that like, like let's say we go back to this example, okay? Suppose that the agent only values the reward 54 at a fourth, okay, right? So this is now 54 over 4, 26 over 2, I don't know, oh wait, I don't know, 27 over 2. So it's like 13 and a half. Values is 13 and a half, this is like 3, so 10 and a half left, plus 36 times, also wait, 9 plus 6, so wait, so this is 13 and a half, that's really interesting. So maybe they actually follow. 15, 27, 33. Oh, this is times a quarter. So this is I'm trying to figure out oh yeah, right, because this is not the actual lowest cost path. The actual lowest cost node is right here. So you have 9. So here this is worth 13, or what is it? Yeah, 13 to you or something, 13 and a half to you. This is worth 9. You feel it costs independently of your present bias versus the present from this order node. So you can see there's only 4 and a half left. So this is 6 plus 6 plus 12, 18, 24. Even if you discount this by a factor of 4, that's still worth 6 to you. So you perceive the cost as higher, as too high. So from here you would drop out. You perceive a cost of 9 plus 6 is 15, and you perceive the reward as only being worth 13 and a half. This is the present bias parameter was a quarter, even though I calculated as if it were a third. So the agent drops out. That's of course not a good scenario. The agent doesn't even finish the task.
You'd give them a bigger reward.
Yes, exactly. So that's what I was saying with the uncertain varying level of present bias. Is what I'd say is if I thought you might have present bias parameters as low as a quarter, I would calculate this reward as if beta were a fourth. So I calculate it to be 15. I could make this reward 60 instead. So for example, if you have like a normal distribution or something like that, or okay, let's say for convenience, let's say you believe that the present bias is like uniformly distributed between like 1/4 and a third plus a fourth. So its mean is a third, but it's lower, its minimum possible value is a quarter.
But
yeah.
Swiss bonds are going for 0 interest now. So if you have 0 discount on these things,
It's a beta of 1. You're meaning a beta of 1.
to payoff, yes, isn't that a payoff?
Beta of 1.
Right, so if you have no interest, that probably means that like you have like no preference between the present and the future or something like that.
Right.
So you have no present bias. So in that sense your beta is too high. In that sense, you're like, oh good, big huge reward 54, I'm going to claim that, you can't stop me. And so then it's like, oops.
Mark?
Yes. Yes.
Taking Social Security as a concrete example,
Sure.
and governments.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any outcomes where using this weak following approach that that produce greater savings for the government than the government just using its ability to coerce citizens to take the path that it wants them to?
Well, so if you assume that you have like unlimited power, you could just say, well, I guess I'm going to swoop into all your bank accounts and like steal your nickels and dimes and put them into a social security account by force. So what I'm going to assume for the sake of this, I actually thought about saying that title of my piece is like how to enslave people, like or something like that. But then it's like they still want to do this at every step of the way, so they're not actually enslaved, like as in they're doing things they don't want to. That'd be really interesting. Again, like that's outside the scope of the model, and I haven't thought about how to formalize the trade-off, like between use of power and how much you don't like that. Of course, in a practical situation, you would take stock of all your options and figure out what's best, and maybe that would be best. I don't know. Maybe really, yeah. So, did you? Yes.
So how does this change, I guess, with exponential discounting?
Right. Okay. So here's the thing. So yeah, you might have noticed that there was no exponential discounting. I said that essentially we can do that. I just set this typical delta parameter to be 1. That's pretty standard in the literature. Both the paper I was directly inspired by and others. If you have exponential discounting. That's a really good question, actually. Somebody should redo my thesis doing that. Maybe I will. Yeah. So here's the thing. So I will comment more generally on like so exponential discounting doesn't actually is actually time consistent. So what that is to say is that like, if I prefer, option A to option B, so okay, clearly right here, like, back here, the agent's like, it's not even worth it to go, if it were just the target path, it wouldn't even be worth it to go here, okay, because this is not big enough to cover all these costs or something, okay, but by the time I get here, I'd rather go up here. So it changes his mind. Right here, it's going to go here, but right here it prefers, but like the fork actually prefers to go here, so it changes its mind what it prefers to do. That's time inconsistency, but exponential discounting would not actually change people's relative preferences. So my guess is that like essentially you'd have a version of this approach. I'm not sure if the actual numbers would change at all or not. That's a really interesting question, or how they would change. But essentially, I think that some version of this would work, okay? Because my version basically says, okay, I can get you to at some point you want to do this other thing, so I'll make it such that you do other actions building up toward that thing. But then at some point you're going to change your mind and no longer want to do that thing. So it'll be easier for you to, for me to like make a bluff that will get you to do some good things, but not actually expect my bluff to be called. So because exponential discounting wouldn't change that, my guess is like at some level my result should, like something similar to my result should hold. But it would be really interesting to work it, like if you throw an exponential discount on top of all this, yeah.
Questions? Okay, well, I'd like to have a big award.